We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles and honours.
Camilla believed for years that one thing was certain. As long as Charles stood beside her, no one could touch what she had built. William could object quietly. Catherine could keep her distance. Advisors could raise concerns in careful language. But Charles was king, and Camilla had spent enough time inside this institution to understand that the king's protection was the wall that everything else depended on. Then she sat in a room and discovered that the wall had already fallen. Not because William had forced it down, not because Catherine had engineered its collapse, because Charles had signed a document months earlier that he apparently didn't fully understand, and that document had quietly done what no confrontation could have managed openly. It had placed an expiration date on Camilla's title. The emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace didn't end with a dramatic argument. It ended with Camilla touching the initials at the bottom of a page, looking across the table at the man she had waited decades to stand beside, and asking him one question. He paused before answering. That pause was everything. The room nobody saw coming. The meeting happened behind closed doors, away from cameras and staff and the polished language the palace normally uses to manage family conflict. William arrived first. Catherine followed. Charles and Camilla were already seated. In the center of the table lay a sealed succession file. Not a draft, not a proposal, not something still under discussion. A decision that had already moved far beyond the stage where it could be quietly redirected.
The experiences the frontline workers are going through now is like nothing that anyone has ever seen. I would believe a lot of them are getting on with the job and making us all very proud by how their stoicism and their determination to beat them.
A senior advisor opened the folder and read the first clause. Camilla would remain queen for the duration of Charles's reign. That was not in dispute, but when that reign ended, the title, the household authority, the ceremonial precedence, and the influence attached to her position would end with no automatic continuation, no protected role, no separate center of power that could carry itself into the next monarch's court. William had not come to propose this. He had come to confirm it. The requests that changed everything. For months before the meeting, a palace team had been examining how royal households would operate after Charles's reign ended. It had begun as a routine administrative exercise. Staffing levels, residences, security arrangements. Nothing that should have divided anyone. Then the requests started arriving from Camilla's household. One asked that several members of her staff remain in place after William became king. Another sought continuing influence over appointments connected to charities, residences, and ceremonial offices. A third proposed that travel, security, and accommodation arrangements should continue for people connected to Camilla, even when they held no formal duty under the next monarch. One request arrived 3 weeks after constitutional advisors had delivered a formal warning. No title, household, or privilege attached to a reigning consort could automatically survive the transition to a new reign. The warning was ignored. Another request followed after a second meeting with advisors. A final request was submitted only days before William and Catherine were summoned to review the succession file. Individually, each item looked manageable. Together, they looked like a structure, a household designed not to wind down gracefully, but to carry its own authority through the transition and continue operating under the next king without his permission. William had read every page before he walked into that room. He saw what the requests were building toward, what William said, and what Catherine's silence meant. When William finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone directly. He said the monarchy could not enter its next chapter while carrying unresolved questions about loyalty, entitlement, and control. There would be one sovereign, one household, and one clear line of authority. Camilla's future position could not stand above that rule. Catherine remained silent throughout most of what followed. That silence unsettled Camilla more than any argument could have. William was expected to defend his future reign. Catherine's presence confirmed that the decision was shared. She had not come to observe. She had come to confirm. Then the second page was turned. It listed the requests in full. Every item, every clause, every expanded arrangement. Read together, they described something Camilla had not intended to name aloud. A parallel household, positioned to survive a king it had not been given permission to outlast. Charles looked toward William, waiting for hesitation. None came. Catherine had been quiet for most of the meeting. When she finally spoke, she asked a single question that no one in the room could answer. She pointed to the requests involving residences, staffing, and access for members of Camilla's family. She noted that several of these people held no constitutional duty under the next reign. Then she asked, what service would these privileges represent? The room went silent. That silence exposed the weakness at the center of the entire argument. Royal privilege can be defended when it supports public duty. It becomes almost impossible to explain when it follows private loyalty instead. Camilla tried to shift the ground. She said the requests had come from officials, not from her directly. That she hadn't approved every phrase, that a household of this scale generated enormous amounts of paperwork, and not every line reached her desk. That answer created a new problem. If Camilla hadn't approved the requests, then someone inside her office had been planning far beyond her instructions, and if she had approved them, she had walked into the meeting knowing exactly what William had already discovered.
I think it's very important that tradition stays, and tradition has a huge part of all this. But there's also points where you look at tradition and go, is that still fit for purpose today? Is that still the right thing to do? Are we still doing and having the most impact we could be having?
Either possibility was damaging. The senior advisor turned to the record of warnings. Camilla's office had been told more than once. The warnings had been sent. A receipt confirmed one had been opened. The following morning, a meeting had been added to Camilla's private schedule with no subject listed and no minutes filed. Later that day, the phrase continuation beyond the present sovereign appeared in a revised request. Someone had acted on the warning by working around it. When Anne walked in, the door opened without ceremony. Princess Anne had been asked to review the reform because of her experience with royal households across 2 reigns. She knew the arguments before she stepped into the room. She also knew exactly where the weakness lay. She didn't look at Camilla first, she looked at Charles. She reminded him that reform only carries weight when the person who created it accepts its limits. A monarch cannot demand discipline from the family, reduce households, question long-standing arrangements, and then suspend every principle when the same scrutiny reaches his own wife. Charles said Camilla was not simply another family member. Anne agreed. That was precisely why the standard had to be clearer, not weaker. Camilla accused Anne of joining William and Catherine against her.
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me, is the idea of being able to bring some change.
Anne refused the accusation. The issue wasn't personal affection, she said. It was institutional clarity. One office belonged to the current reign. Another would belong to the next. Blurring them would leave staff, advisors, and relatives claiming authority from 2 competing sources. The danger wasn't dramatic. It was administrative, which made it worse. A palace doesn't fall through open confrontation. It falls through one disputed instruction, one appointment challenged by 2 offices, one relative promised access that the new sovereign refuses to recognize. The document with Catherine's name. Near the end of the meeting, a sealed attachment was placed on the table. It carried Catherine's name on the front. It was not written by her. It was a memorandum prepared after a private consultation she had attended with constitutional advisors responsible for the next reign. Catherine had asked one question at that consultation. What would happen if a former queen continued issuing instructions through staff after a new sovereign took the throne? The answer filled 3 pages. Any unofficial direction from such a figure could create confusion over appointments, access, security, and public representation. It could force the next king to challenge his predecessor's widow in public. The advisors recommended that all authority connected to a serving consort cease at the transition of reign unless the incoming sovereign specifically renewed it. Below that recommendation was Catherine's written response. Agreed in principle. Camilla read it and understood. Catherine hadn't entered the emergency meeting simply as William's quiet supporter. She had asked the question that brought everyone to the table in the first place. She had identified the risk, requested the analysis, received the recommendation, and confirmed her agreement, months before anyone else in the room knew the meeting was coming. The initials, at the bottom of the page. Charles finally answered the question Camilla had been building toward all evening. He said he had known about the reform. He had known it would reduce future households, but he had not understood that advisors would apply it to her title so completely. He had believed that respect for her position would survive every technical change. Camilla asked whether he had read the final clauses. Charles paused. That pause was enough. He had signed the framework, he had trusted others to manage the details, and somewhere between his intention and the language entered into the succession file, Camilla's future authority had quietly disappeared. The legal advisor explained the consequence clearly. Charles could challenge the framework, he could request a new review, he could attempt to amend it, but he could not make the existing record disappear, and any exception written specifically to protect Camilla would have to be recorded, justified, and defended publicly. It would show that the reform applied to every household except the king's own. It would reopen every decision already made: residences, staff, funding, security, titles. Nothing would remain settled. Camilla asked Charles to withdraw the decision before anyone outside the room learned of it. William met her eyes. Charles could object, he could delay, but he could no longer erase it quietly. The decision had already entered the succession framework. It had been circulated to the legal office, the private secretaries, and the advisors responsible for the next reign. It was no longer a private conversation. It was already part of the machinery preparing for what came next. What Camilla said before she left. Camilla looked at Catherine, not at William, not at Anne. She asked whether Catherine understood what she was supporting. Every word carried years of frustration. She said Catherine had entered royal life welcomed by the public, protected by William, embraced as the monarchy's future. Camilla's path had been different. She had waited decades for what she had, and now Catherine was helping place an ending beneath it. Catherine closed the appendix and placed both hands on the table. She said sacrifice could explain why a title mattered deeply. It could not determine how that title should operate after its constitutional purpose had ended. She acknowledged the years Camilla had spent under public pressure. She acknowledged that Charles had chosen her, defended her, and built a place for her within his reign. None of that was being erased, but the next reign could not be governed by debts created it. And the last one, a title was not compensation. It was service, and service ended when the role ended. Camilla asked whether Catherine expected to surrender everything just as easily when her own time came. Catherine answered without hesitation. If her duties ended, the authority attached to them should end as well. No household should survive simply because its former head found comfort in power. William looked at his wife. He had known her position. Hearing it plainly gave the decision a moral weight that legal language couldn't provide. Camilla stood. She said every person in the room had made a choice, and one day each would have to live with how that choice was remembered. Then she left. The door closed softly, and that was the moment the dispute became permanent. What remained after she left? Charles stayed by the window after William and Catherine departed. William had approached him, but Charles raised one hand. He didn't want explanation. Not then. The son who would inherit the crown had protected the institution. The husband who wore it had failed to protect the woman beside him. Both truths existed in the same room, at the same moment, and neither could cancel the other out. Anne stayed behind after the others left. She told Charles that succession questions don't disappear because a family refuses to discuss them. They wait, they gather weight, then they return at the worst possible moment. Outside the room, Camilla's household began receiving new instructions. Staff contracts would be reviewed, future access would require approval, private arrangements would be separated from constitutional ones. Nothing changed publicly that night, but inside the palace, preparation had begun. William and Catherine left through a private corridor without speaking to waiting staff. They had entered as the Prince and Princess of Wales. They walked out as the united center of the next reign. Camilla still had her title. She no longer controlled its future, and Charles stood, alone by a window, staring at his own initials at the bottom of a page, trying to work out whether he had misunderstood what he signed, or whether, somewhere beneath the paperwork and the careful language, he had always known where it would lead, and simply could not bring himself to be the one to finish it. No shouting, no public statement, no dramatic scene. Just a sealed succession file, a set of initials on the bottom of a page, and a door that closed softly behind the woman who had waited 30 years to stand where she was standing. The title isn't gone yet, but its ending has been written. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think William and Catherine were right to draw this line now while Charles is still king? Or should this have waited? Drop your honest take in the comments below. If this breakdown gave you the full picture on one of the most significant behind-the-scenes moments in the modern monarchy, hit the like button. And subscribe if you haven't yet. We tell royal stories the way they actually happen. See you in the next one.